So in this video, I want to show you an automation that I sold to a client for $1,500, and it's a LinkedIn scraper. So I've consulted with a few dozen clients in the AI and automation space, and the trend that I'm seeing right now, what automations are people willing to pay for come around lead research, lead automation, and lead enrichment. And I know a lot of you guys are getting into the AI automation game in order to actually make money with clients. So let me know in the comments below if these types of videos showing you actual automations that I sold to clients are helpful and what you want to see next. And just to give a little context, this client was in the life insurance business, and what their end goal was, they wanted to take webinars or these live replay videos from LinkedIn and scrape all of the commenters who were interacting with the content, right? So the idea was these were people on LinkedIn who were interacting and engaging with content that was related to the life insurance niche. And so what they were going to do is scrape a list of leads and then reach out to them directly. So in this video, I'm going to use a different niche. So this is a Zapier webinar that they ran. And so again, the use case in my video is, let's pretend that there's a bunch of people, right? There's 42 comments on this Zapier webinar replay, and these are good leads for me. Maybe I can reach out to them to see if they need any help with their automation. So what's a good way to scrape their information, put it in a Google Sheet so I can reach out? So there is one thing you need to know about LinkedIn webinars, or they call them events, when you're trying to scrape them, is that when you're signed out of LinkedIn, which is how a scraper is accessing LinkedIn, when we're talking about these event URLs, watch what happens when I put this into my browser here. You'll see that there are 0 commenters here, right? So a scraper, a traditional LinkedIn scraper, is not going to be able to get to the information, right? Because there's no LinkedIn profiles, there's no commenters at this URL when you're in a logged out state. So this is a challenge that we ran into, and we solved it with a very cool Gumloop feature. So let me demo how this works, and then we'll build it out step by step in Gumloop. So again, we're on just this random Zapier webinar, and the goal is I want to export all of these people into a Google Sheet so I can follow up with them later on. So I've got a blank Google Sheet here just to show you that it's empty, and there's a bunch of commenters here that are commenting under this Zapier webinar. So what I'm going to do is actually use a Gumloop Chrome extension. And when I open this up, I'm going to be able to run a flow directly from Google Chrome. And you can see what this is doing is it's interacting with my Gumloop workflow directly through the Chrome extension. So everything is being run in the background as normal. And I can even click into it right now and see the actual flow. And what it's going to do is scrape those profiles from LinkedIn in a logged in state, meaning that I'm logged into LinkedIn when I'm running this flow, so I'm able to actually see the profiles, unlike most LinkedIn scrapers when you're logged out. And so this flow has already finished, and we'll run through exactly what it's doing. But now you can see I have a Google Sheet that is filled with all of the people who were commenting on that post. I've got the webinar URL, I've got their profile URL, first and last name, if their email is available, their job title, if their phone number is available, and the state and city that they live in. All right, so let me walk you through the flow in Gumloop, and then we can build it out step by step. So this is starting with their browser extension input. Again, Gumloop has a Chrome extension, so you can run their flows directly from a page in Chrome, and I'll show you how to set that up. So that's the trigger, is that again, when we're on the LinkedIn page, we can just come into the Chrome extension and then hit play on our flow, and it's going to execute the scrape on the page that we're on while we're in, importantly for LinkedIn, in a logged in state. And now what we're doing after that is we are going to extract the LinkedIn profile URLs, because what this browser extension is doing is it's grabbing all of the URLs, or any URL that's on the page that it's scraping, right? So any URL like this about page, the accessibility, anything that's a URL, it's going to scrape, but we don't need every URL from the page. We only care about the LinkedIn profile URL. So that's what this node is doing. It's extracting just those nodes. Now, let's go over here. In what I'm doing is I'm taking the webinar URL, which is the input, and I'm doing a little manipulation on this side of the automation, and then I'm just passing the webinar URL into the final Google Sheet, right? So every time we scrape, we know what the URL of the webinar was. So that's what this part of the automation is over here. We're just doing a little text manipulation to get that into Google Sheets. And then with our LinkedIn URLs, and again, that's really the key data point here. We're gonna flatten a list. I'll get into that in a second. But what that's gonna do is just give us a list of LinkedIn URLs. And so we're doing two things with that. The first thing is we're gonna use a LinkedIn profile scraper. So we're gonna take those LinkedIn profile URLs and extract their name and their job title and their state and city on this part of the flow. And then over here, we're going to use ProxyCurl with the data enrichment node in Gumloop. And we're going to try to get their email address and phone number, although in my experience, it doesn't really output that most of the time. But for this demo, we'll try to use that. And then what we're doing is that we're putting all of that information back into our Google Sheets. So we have a Google Sheet Writer node over here. So we got the webinar URL, their LinkedIn profile URL, which again is the source for most of this data. First and last name, email and phone, job title, state and city. So you can go to any webinar on LinkedIn, open up the comments and load more comments, and then scrape all of the leads and have it sent directly to your database. All right, so let's build this out step by step inside of Gumloop. So I'm in my dashboard. I'm going to click create a new flow, and we'll call this one LinkedIn Scraping School, which reminds me, if you want to get access to all of my templates, be sure to check out the link below to my school community, where you will find all of my AI agents and AI automations inside of school. All right, so again, to trigger this automation, we are going to use a node or a feature of Gumloop that I don't think a lot of people know about, which again is this Gumloop Chrome extension, okay? So this lets you run automations, an automation that you build in Gumloop, but it lets you run it on the web. And so the instance that we're gonna use here is this content scraping. It also allows you to do a browser session replay. We're gonna focus on this content scraping. So let me come back and we're gonna add our first node here. And let me just search for Chrome. And again, we're not gonna focus on the browser replay. We're gonna focus on scraping. So I'm gonna choose the browser extension input node. So I'll drag that in. Let me just save that. All right, so the first thing that we wanna do is select our action, right? So once I hit play in my Gumloop extension, what do I want this scraper to do? So in our instance, again, we're interested in the LinkedIn profile URLs, right? So when I open this profile, what I want really as my output is this URL, so I can feed that into the rest of my automation. So for the action, when I click the drop down, there's a couple of options here, like scrape, take a screenshot of the full page, which is kind of cool. But I want get all URLs, and I'm going to save this. And now what you need to do, obviously, if you have not installed the Chrome extension, is you want to install that inside of Chrome. So it's linked to from this article, but obviously you can just go into Google and search for Gumloop Chrome extension. And once you do and pin it to your browser, you'll see the G icon up here, okay? So once I open this, all right, you can see when I refresh my flow, right, what will happen is the name of your flow, right, which is LinkedIn Scraping School, you can see I now have that flow available for me to run inside of Chrome. So again, all I did was I created a new flow, I added the browser extension, and I gave my workflow a new name, and then I saved it, and I came into my Gumloop extension, and I hit this little refresh button, and after I did that, now we can see that I have this available to me to run on any website. All right, so the first thing that we're gonna do is what I want to get in my output is I wanna see the webinar URL every time we make an entry. So in other words, every time we find a new LinkedIn profile URL, I also want to know the webinar that that person came from. But in order to do that, we need to kind of add a few intermediate steps, because all that Gumloop will output here is a single URL. It'll output the URL once, but when we're running this flow, we're going to be getting, a half a dozen to a dozen people. And we need the webinar URL to populate every single time we get a new profile URL. So in order to do that, we need to do, again, a couple of intermediate steps. So let me add a node here, and I'm going to search for get list item. So what I want to do is pull out the list item from the browser extension, right? So let me connect the browser extension to the get list item. And just so I can kind of keep track here, I'm going to rename this to get webinar URL. Okay. And what I'm going to do for the list, I am going to select the URL list. But what I need to do first is actually put this in loop mode, so it will output a list. So loop mode just means it's going to run not just once, but for as many times as it needs to run to finish the action. So don't forget to turn your extension into loop mode. And now that I do have that list, I'm going to grab my URL list and drag it here. And then for the index, which is just the starting point, right, the first item in the list that you want to extract, I'm going to put it at 0. And then we're going to come back to this part of the flow in just a second. We just need to build out another part of it before we can finish that. All right, so let's focus on extracting the LinkedIn URL. Because again, our browser extension is going to get every single URL that's on the page, but all we care about are these LinkedIn URLs that we can feed into the rest of our automation, right? So to do that, I'm going to use an extract data node, search for extract data node, and let's connect the browser extension output to my extract data. And I'll rename this to extract LinkedIn URL. And then what do I want to extract is the action output, right? Or all of the output from the browser extension, which is going to be a list of a bunch of URLs, right? So that's what I want to extract the content from. And then for additional context, this is very important because this node is going to be just fed a bunch of different URLs, and we only want these LinkedIn URLs. So I'm saying extract the LinkedIn profile URL and only the LinkedIn profile URL. And then I'm giving it an example here so it knows exactly what to look for. And then we need to click on extract list because it's going to be given a bunch of URLs, and we don't only want it to extract one LinkedIn URL, we want every single one that it gets. And then lastly, we need to define the data that we're looking for, right? What is the field that we want to define? So I'm going to call this profile underscore URL. The type will be text, and then I am going to give it a description, which is just going to be an example again. So I really want to kind of hammer home to this node exactly what we're looking for, which are these LinkedIn URLs. For the model, I'll keep this at GPT-4.1 mini, and then I'm just going to save. And we can test this at any point. So again, we have our browser extension as the input. So let me just come to this Zapier webinar again. We've got a handful of commenters, and I'm going to go into my Gumloop extension. I'm going to search for the school version, which is what we're building right now. And again, we just have to hit play, and this is going to kick off the Gumloop flow, and you can check the flow by clicking this little out arrow here. And this is just going to take you right inside and show you the steps. So you can see it did succeed. And actually what I'm most curious about is the extract data node. But let's look at what's going on with our flow. So you can see from our browser extension, the URL is the URL obviously from LinkedIn. And then when we look at the action output, and again, the action is get all URLs. So that's the output. And again, as I said, it's going to get pretty much every single URL that's on this page, right? And we don't need all of this extra stuff at the top. We only want these LinkedIn URLs. So I'm going to go into my extract LinkedIn URL node to see if it's working. So the input, again, is that giant list of URLs. And now for the output, what I want to see here are the LinkedIn URL. So this does appear to be working. We've got these LinkedIn profile URLs. So some have their name in them. Some of them are just a kind of a plain URL, which does redirect to the profile. So this is how you can test if your extract data node is working. All right, so one thing you may have noticed with our extract data node on the output here is that yes, it did give us the LinkedIn URLs, but it gave it to us as one kind of item in a list, right? This is just one output, a bunch of LinkedIn URLs, but we don't want that. We want each LinkedIn URL to be its own item, right? Not a bunch of ones that are just joined together. So in order to kind of extract those out one by one, we want to add a new node here, and that's going to be a flattened list. So I'm going to drag this flattened list of lists, okay? And I'm going to connect the output from our extract data node and then drag this list of lists to the input here. And what this should do, and let me see if I can resume here, is, as it says, flatten it out. All right, it's not letting me resume from the previous flow. That's fine. I'll show you what this node is doing once we run it again from scratch. I just don't need to run it again right now. But what we can do is finish off this part of the flow, which again is to duplicate the webinar URL for every single entry in our Google Sheet. So in order to do that, I'm going to add a duplicate node here under my get list item. So let me connect the output from the get list item to the input to our duplicate node. And then what I also want to do is connect this LinkedIn profile URL, which again is the list of individualized LinkedIn URLs. And so what we're going to do here is duplicate, again, we're going to have a webinar URL. The first time we run it, it's only going to output it once. But we want it to basically copy paste every time we get a new profile URL. So that's what we're doing here. So in order to duplicate that, we need to add those two inputs. So one is the webinar URL itself, and the second one is going to be the LinkedIn profile URL because we want it to match, right? So every time we get a new profile URL, we want it to also copy the webinar URL, right? So that's what we're matching here. So for the list size to match, we want, again, the URL of the LinkedIn profile. So in other words, every time we get a new profile URL, that's the list size that we match. So if we get 5 profile URLs, we want to match that list size with 5 webinar URL. So for the duplicate node, for the list size to match, I'm going to drag in the output from this flattened list of lists. So that's going to go over here. And then the input, right? What do we actually want to duplicate? It's the webinar URL. So I'm going to drag that item over here. And now what we're going to get is the webinar URL will be duplicated over and over and over again to match the exact number of times that we get a new profile URL. I know it's somewhat confusing, but if you're trying to output these lists to Google Sheets, you need to do this. Okay, now let's get to the actual data enrichment and data extraction. And the first thing that we're going to do is get the LinkedIn information from our LinkedIn profile. So let me go into Gumloop, and I want the LinkedIn profile scraper. So let me drag that down over here. And what I want to connect, right, the input that we need is the LinkedIn URL. And again, we're getting this from this flattened list of lists, which is basically extracting one LinkedIn profile URL at a time. That's why we're using this node. So let me connect that here. For the input, we need the LinkedIn URL, which is going to be this node over here. That's automatically going to go on loop mode. And then for scraped information, you can grab whatever you want. For this, we're doing first name, last name, job title, state, and city, but there's a bunch of different pieces of data that you can extract with Gumloop's native LinkedIn node. So check out all of the other outputs and data you can get if you're interested in getting more information. But we can add another node here if we want to try to get more information. So again, our LinkedIn profile scraper is not going to get us an email address. It's not going to get us a phone number, but Gumloop does have an integration here that they call, and I can see it up here, it's enrich contact information right under data enrichment. So let me just drag this onto my canvas here and explain what we're going to do with this node. All right, so this node offers a couple of different ways to get or enrich information. So the first thing that I want to look at is this providers. So right now they have Apollo, they have ProxyCurl, and they have Hunter.io. And you can also connect your own API account directly through these providers. And for this example, I already have an API with ProxyCurl, so I'm going to use ProxyCurl. You can use all three if you want, but this is where you select the provider. So just for this demo, I'm going to click out of Apollo and Hunter, but you can use whatever you want. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. Now, the second thing that I'm going to do is what information are we going to provide in order to get the enrichment, right? So in this instance, it's not a domain name, right? We're not enriching people based on their domain name. What we're enriching is based on their LinkedIn profile URL, okay? So for the input here, I want to X out of domain name, and let's just look at the options. I'm just curious here. So you can input on domain name, first or last, email address, job title, company, or LinkedIn URL. So there's a lot of options here to choose your input. For this flow, again, we're using the LinkedIn URL. So let me select that. And now what it's going to do is change my input here, right? So it's asking me to give them, or give the node rather, the LinkedIn URL as the input. And again, that's actually coming from this node, which is the flattened list of lists. So I'm going to drag this over to enrich contact. And now I have my input, right? I can drag this list into the LinkedIn URL field. And so now what this node is going to do, it's going to use ProxyCurl to take the LinkedIn URL and what contact information are we going to try to get? So in this demo, we're going to try to get the email and we're going to try to get the phone number. Now, I will say in my testing with this node and with ProxyCurl, it's like a 10% success rate. Just as a fair heads up, I have not tested Apollo, but that's what I've been seeing with ProxyCurl. All right, we only need one more node and then we can test this out. So obviously we're writing this all to a Google spreadsheet so we can keep track of all of our leads here. And so what we need is a Google Sheets writer node. So let me drag that onto the canvas here. So what you're going to want to do, you're going to need to connect your Google account, of course, and then you just want to pick the file from your Google Sheets. So mine is Scrape LinkedIn Webinars. And once you pick your sheet or your spreadsheet, what's going to happen is it's going to start to populate your columns, but you always want to come down here and make sure that for some reason, it only picks like the first 4 or 5 columns. So come in here and make sure that all of your columns are actually selected. And once you do that, they will be available here to give it the input, okay? So now we need to connect a lot of these nodes, almost all of them, in order to kind of populate our spreadsheet. So let's start with the LinkedIn node. Let me drag that output over here, and now we can start to populate our Google Sheets, right? So first name I can drag, and I'm gonna get an error there because I always forget this. So in Google Sheets, in the node, scroll down to the bottom, and what we're doing here is we're gonna write multiple entries, right? So if we scrape 10 commenters on a webinar, we're going to add 10 profiles to our spreadsheet. So in writer mode, you want to come down here and change this to add new rows, which is plural. So you can see the error went away over there. So let me keep going. So last name, we can drag job title, we can drag state, and then city. So we've got all of our LinkedIn output. Next, we're going to use the enrich contact info from ProxyCurl. So let's drag that one over. And now we've got our email address and our phone number. And what we need next are the profile URLs from LinkedIn and the webinar URL. Remember, we went through all of that work to get the webinar URL, so we want to put it in the input here. All right, so for the webinar URL, remember, we did all of this work up here to duplicate the list. So this is where we want to get this webinar URL. And if you wanted to, you could rename that node to webinar URLs, but I want to drag this into Google Sheets here. And now it's going to be available for me to drag into the input field here. And now the last field that we need is the profile URL, or the LinkedIn profile URL. And we're going to grab that from our flattened list of lists. So let me drag that over here. And now I can use that output as an input for my Google Sheet. So now we have all of the fields connected to all of our outputs. We've got our spreadsheet selected, and we've got writer mode on add new rows. So now we are ready to test this out. So let me come into Zapier, and maybe let's use a new webinar here. So if you're looking on where to find these, I'm under the company page here, and then it's these events, right? These past events. So let me view the most recent one that they've had. And one thing to note, since we're using the Chrome extension and it's really going to mirror whatever's on your page, with these comments, you'll notice that LinkedIn uses this kind of load more comments. So if you're trying to get every single comment, make sure you hit load more comments. And that's going to show, obviously, more comments and more profiles for your scraper to grab. But your scraper in this build, anyway, is only going to scrape whatever is on the page. So there's more comments under here that's not being shown on Chrome. In order to get those, you need to click that button. For these purposes, I don't need every single person here. I just want to demo that this is hopefully working. So I think we're ready to go here. So again, our spreadsheet is empty. I'm going to come into this page here, go up to my Chrome extensions. And again, this is the school version. So I'm going to hit play. And then once it starts running, again, we're able to click this arrow and see the actual live flow here. All right, so we can see that it's running now in the background. It's taking the browser input. It's extracting the LinkedIn URLs. And then we're doing kind of this manipulation over here with those URLs. So again, remember, this is what I talked about earlier. It's taking this blob of text and it's going to output it as a nice list with individual URL profiles that we can send to that LinkedIn writer. All right, so my ProxyCurl API keys have been exhausted. Let me go check that real quick. All right, well, I topped off my ProxyCurl API account. Let's see if this works now. Always check your API before running a video like this. All right, so let's go back into this LinkedIn video here, and I'm gonna do the Gumloop Chrome extension, and then this is the correct flow, the school flow. All right, so let's hit play. All right, so we can open this up in a new tab again, and let's see what happens. And our spreadsheet is still blank, which makes sense. All right, so it did enrich the contact information, so that's good. I mean, it went through this very fast. So you can see that the Google Sheets writer is done. So let me just come into here. So we have, again, our webinar URL, and this was, we spent some time on making sure that this URL was actually written to the sheet in every single row. We've got our profile URLs in this second column here. So this is someone who was engaging with Zapier webinars in case we wanted to reach out. We've got first and last name. We've got email, where it was able to pull it, phone, where it was able to pull it. We've got the job title, the state, and the city. So it's working very well. Let's just come into the flow here. And again, what we're doing is we're grabbing the browser extension. The output is going to be all of those scraped URLs. And then this node is going to extract just the LinkedIn URLs. And then what this node is going to do is turn that into a list of individual items that we can just pass through. Then we're enriching the contact with ProxyCurl. Then we're using the LinkedIn profile scraper. Okay, so it's pulling the city and the state and all this other information. This is the webinar URL step, all right, just to show you what's going on here. So it's doing the webinar URL steps, and then it's writing it to our Google Sheet. So again, this was a simple Gumloop automation that I sold to a client for $1,500. And again, the value comes out of being able to find and generate and enrich leads. That's a lot of where I'm seeing clients and prospective clients come in. They have databases, they're looking for leads, they're looking to outreach to leads, which obviously will help with the sales and generating revenue. So if you're trying to make money with these AI automations, I would focus on ways that you can help sales teams and marketing teams get new customers, get new leads, enrich new leads, scrape data. Those kind of flows seem to be where companies are reaching out for help in this space. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content about automations that are actually attracting client work, do me a favor, comment below, like the video, subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out.